Hello and welcome to another Womercatch World. And this week I shall be talking about the music of Genesis, both as a group and the solo albums of the members of the group. And here with me again is Denzel Gumpo.
Your sidekick.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. So this is the second episode into this series. We've done the episode one, which was the introduction to what we'll be talking about.
Yes.
And this today you'll be talking more about one of your favourite bands.
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
And I first got into the music of Genesis through becoming interested in the music of Peter Gabriel as a solo artist. Now, I was vaguely aware of Genesis in the 1970s, but I was really a bit too young to really appreciate what they were doing. And in the early 80s, I did start listening to Peter Gabriel's music. The first single of his that I bought was a song called Games Without Frontiers, which got to number 4 in the British charts in 1980, and 2.5 years after that, he did another single called I Have the Touch, which didn't really do anything, which I thought was a great shame, because it was a very good song, and having listened to Peter Gabriel and buying albums by him, I then started listening to the albums of his former group, and his former group went through several different lineups. The group was formed at Charterhouse in the 1960s from the Peter Gabriel himself started off as a drummer with a couple of groups, one called The Spoken Word and one called Melods. And when he was at Charterhouse, he formed a group with Tony Banks called The Garden Wall, and there was another group at the school formed by Ant Phillips and Mike Rutherford called The Anon, and eventually these two groups joined forces, and they did a demo, which it so fell out that a former pupil of Charterhouse, Jonathan King, was visiting the school. Jonathan King, who later had something of a fall from favour with various other activities which we won't go into at this point.
But at that time, though, he was well known when he did school. Yeah.
He had just had a hit himself with a self-penned song called Everyone's Gone to the Moon. And it is ironic that the song was also introduced by Jimmy Savile, who has also since gone through a fall from grace.
To put it mildly.
Yes. But he was visiting his old school, and he was given a tape, and when he asked what the name of the group was, they said, "Oh, we don't have a name yet." And he says himself that he made the mistake of listening to it and he liked what he heard, and so he named the group Genesis.
So that's how that name came about.
Yes, yes, and he produced the first album of theirs, which was an album called From Genesis to Revelations, and they did a couple of singles, and to begin with they didn't have a permanent drummer, so the drummer on the first two singles was Chris Stewart, who was a fellow pupil at Charterhouse, and the first single was a song called The Silent Sun, which was written by Tony Banks and Peter Gabriel, and the B-side was a song called That's Me by Ant Phillips and Mike Rutherford, and the second single was a song called Winter's Tale, which was another Gabriel Banks song, and that was backed with One-Eyed Hound, another Gabriel Banks song. Neither of the first two singles did anything.
In the charts?
No. And the first album didn't do anything. In fact, the first album sold about 600 copies in all. Now, one of the things was that because of the title, From Genesis to Revelation, it was put in with all the religious music.
Right.
So, and it could have been described as spiritual music, but it wasn't really gospel.
It's quite telling though that they went on to have the fame that they've had after their first album bombed.
Yes.
Because usually that's it then, isn't it? That first album, if it's not a hit, that's the end of the band. But that wasn't the case with them.
Yes, so they nevertheless persevered. The drummer on the second album was John Silver, who is now a television producer, they nevertheless continued.
Were they signed to a big label at the time?
Not at the time.
No. Right.
No. They did eventually sign with Charisma, the record executive heard them and advised them to stick with whatever it was they were doing now. But they continued. The second album was Trespass, with John Mayhew on drums. Now they had started performing live by this point, and Ant Phillips actually started to get stage fright, and so they eventually he decided that he couldn't go on, and he said, well that's it, I'm leaving, and the other three thought, well that's it, because Gabriel Banks and Rutherford had all considered Ant Phillips to be really the driving force behind the group, but they then thought about it and reconsidered, and so they set about advertising for a drummer to begin with, and there were several applicants, and they held the auditions at Peter Gabriel's parents' house, and there was a drummer who had played with a couple of groups, one called The Real Thing, not to be confused with a group from Liverpool in the mid 1970s. That was a different group, and he had also played with a group called Pause it.
No, we'll come back to it.
Yeah. Flaming Youth.
There you go.
That was it. That was it. And he had also been a child actor, playing the part of the Artful Dodger in a production of Oliver, and he was also an extra in the film A Hard Day's Night, which featured a well-known group of the 60s. You might have heard of them. They were called the Beatles. And so he ended up joining the group, and he said that at first the atmosphere was rather tense, because these three ex-public school boys were all quite guarded in they didn't really express emotion, because that was the sort of thing that was not, it just wasn't done at British public schools. And for the time they played with a guitarist called Mick Bernard, then one day Peter Gabriel was reading one of the music papers, and he saw an advert in it. Guitarist writer seeks like-minded musicians to strive beyond current existing stagnant forms of music. And Peter Gabriel answered that ad, and it was from Steve Hackett, who had previously played with a group called Quiet World, and so they met with Steve Hackett, and by this time Mick Bernard and John Mayhew had gone along with Ant Phillips, and so the group started writing for the next album, which was an album called Nursery Crime, which did feature a couple of songs that had been co-written with Ant Phillips, and one of these tracks was a song called The Musical Box, which actually Ant Phillips didn't even get any writing credits for the two songs that he had co-written that were on the album. I mean, he was quite philosophical about it. He said, well, I did have the initial idea, but really they all worked on it.
Yeah, he was involved though.
Yeah, but the album Nursery Crime, it didn't really do anything when it was first. It did well in Italy, so Italy really liked the album, but by this time the group were starting to form a particular identity of their own, and Peter Gabriel was starting to become very experimental with costumes, and there was one occasion when they were playing in a boxing ring in Dublin, and Peter Gabriel hadn't told any of the others what he was going to do, but at the gig itself, he wore a fox's head and his wife's red dress, and he said that when he came out, there was just a shock.
Yeah.
But it worked because he and they all said, well, I mean, when he started to dress up, it put a couple of noughts on the money that we were making every night, and Mike Rutherford said that he was very impressed with what Peter Gabriel did, because he said the production budget was only about 20 quid a year, and he actually did very well with just that very limited budget. And so these costumes, many of which were sort of the almost hogged the headlines themselves. Things like the flower head dress that Peter Gabriel wears during Supper's Ready, which is and the flower head dress almost takes the attention away from the rest of it, including Peter Gabriel, because there's just this very good song going on, and the tune and the words, and there's this flower head dress moving around the stage, and so they were becoming very theatrical by now, and the songs were almost performed rather than just sung.
So I suppose that's something that they needed to do then, to stand out.
Yes.
Because at the time there was so many
yes.
bands about, so you just needed to be different.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and so they were getting quite a name for themselves. The album Foxtrot in 1972, which contained the song Supper's Ready. I mean, that was the first album that really started to where they really started to make an impact commercially.
Yeah.
With that album, and so they had really broken through. They were and they were then getting into their stride.
Yeah. So they were starting to make money.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. If not necessarily huge amounts, but
No.
Gradually, and in 1973 they did the album Selling England by the Pound, which is a really very good album.
It's one of your favourites.
It is, yeah. Yes, and it contained the first ever hit single with a song which started off as a riff by Steve Hackett, and then Tony Banks added to the music, and then Peter Gabriel attended an art exhibition by a painter called Betty Swanick, and he was inspired to write the words of I Know What I Like.
Yeah.
And that was the first chart appearance. It got to number 21 in the British charts, and would possibly have gone higher if they had time to promote it. Although they weren't at that point all that keen on the thought of having hit singles, because that was kind of frowned on, and ironically it does sometimes take away from a group when they start being commercially successful. It does alienate some of their earlier followers.
Yeah.
And by this time, the press and media were focusing on Peter Gabriel himself, and he was becoming rather uncomfortable with it, because there was tension within the group, because of all the attention being focused on Peter Gabriel, and I mean, Phil Collins at that time started playing with another group called Brand X, and Mike Rutherford teamed up again with Ant Phillips, and they were to record together for over the next few years.
Right. So was that the end of Genesis as a group at that time?
No.
Were they just doing
it was the start of them doing things individually.
Right.
Because Collins started playing with Brand X, and Mike Rutherford played on some tracks that were on Ant Phillips' first solo album, The Geese and the Ghost, and later on Ant Phillips played on the Mike Rutherford's first solo album, Small Creeps Day, and Steve Hackett started doing a solo album, and
how did his solo stuff do? Because I remember speaking to you about all the bands at that time. We've always said that when they're all together, they make good music, and then when they start doing solo projects, it's never as good as the collective stuff.
I mean, the individual albums of the Genesis members are very good albums. I mean, Ant Phillips, unfortunately, because he left before the group started to become well known, has tended to be overlooked. But the other 5 members, Gabriel, Banks, Rutherford, Hackett and Collins, because they were in a group that was already known, their solo albums
fared... they already had the platform, already had the following. But similar to groups like the Queen, when Freddie Mercury was doing his own solo stuff, he was never the same as the band. Similar with the Beatles as well. But I found with Genesis, though, especially Phil Collins, some of his solo stuff were, commercially, were quite bigger than the Genesis.
And I mean, funnily enough, I mean, when Genesis and Peter Gabriel were together, they didn't have any #1 albums, and they didn't have any #1 singles. But once they, Genesis with the lineup of Banks, Collins and Rutherford have had 6 UK #1 albums and a US #1 single, and Gabriel solo has had 2 UK #1 albums and a US #1 single. And
is that Sledgehammer?
Yes. I mean, it's almost as though Genesis with Gabriel, Banks, Rutherford, Hackett and Collins, it was almost as though it was a bit too much. Whereas once they separated, it was a bit more manageable. For people to take, because there were just so many ideas going on with the group that obviously something had to give. And as I say, in 1975, Gabriel announced that he was going to leave the group, and when he left, originally he was not going to record as a solo artist. He was originally going to write songs for other people and produce other people. And after a couple of years, he had a lot of songs that were written, but he couldn't get what he considered to be the right people interested, and he wasn't going to have any control over the arrangements.
So he decided to record
and so eventually he had all these songs and no one to record them, so he thought, well, I might as well do them myself, and so he put together the group of musicians and he put out his first solo album in 1977.
How did that do?
The first it did quite well. It got to number 7 in the British album charts.
Yeah. That will have been a good accomplishment at the time, because back then people were buying albums. It's not like nowadays where people just download it or watch things on YouTube.
Yes. Genesis as a quartet had continued to be successful. The first album as a quartet, A Trick of the Tail, got to number 3.
So what was in the quartet then?
That was Steve Hackett, Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford, and Phil Collins. And so I suppose if you comparing Genesis as a quartet with Peter Gabriel solo, well, A Trick of the Tail got to number 3 in the album charts, and Wind and Wuthering got to number 7 in the album charts, and Gabriel, his first album, Peter Gabriel 1, got to number 7. So as far as the album charts were concerned, it was Genesis. However, in the singles charts, Peter Gabriel's song Salisbury Hill got to number 13 in the charts, and A Trick of the Tail, which was a Tony Banks song, got to number 42. So that didn't even get into the top 40.
No.
A Mike Rutherford song, Your Own Special Way, from Wind and Wuthering, that only got to number 42. So that didn't get into the top 40. And there were a collection of songs that were left over from Wind and Wuthering, which they put out as an EP called Match of the Day, and that got to number 14. So Gabriel won the battle in the singles chart. And later on, Steve Hackett left the group, and it was then that the group did start to become more commercial, and which did probably upset a lot of the earlier fans. Because I think it's probable that if you like things like The Musical Box and Supper's Ready, then chances are that you probably aren't going to like something like Follow You, Follow Me, and vice versa. If you like Follow You, Follow Me, then
you won't like the old stuff.
Yeah.
So then you've got two different sets of fans.
So the group was sort of starting to develop. Meanwhile, Phil Collins' first marriage was on the rocks, and he said to Banks and Rutherford, "Look, I'm going to have to move to Canada, unless we can sort of continue as we are, I'm going to have to leave."
When was this?
This was in 78, 79. And so Banks and Rutherford said, "Well, hang on, we'll because we're wanting to do solo things." So Tony Banks did his first solo album, A Curious Feeling, and Mike Rutherford did his first solo album, Small Creeps Day.
Yeah.
Collins then sort of locked him away, himself away in his room, because it was obvious that he wasn't able to save his first marriage, and so he locked himself away in his recording studio and wrote a load of songs, which eventually became his first solo album, Face Value, and Steve Hackett had continued with album. His first album had been The Voyage of the Acolyte in 1975, which had Phil Collins and Mike Rutherford had played on, and Mike Rutherford actually co-wrote a couple of the tracks on that album, and Collins and Rutherford had also played on Ant Phillips' first solo album, The Geese and the Ghost, and Mike Rutherford had co-written a couple of the tracks on that, and Gabriel had done his second solo album, Peter Gabriel 2, which that got to number 10 in the album charts, but unfortunately it didn't produce any hit singles, so it was quite interesting that in 1978 there was an album by Genesis as a trio, and there were solo albums from each of the people that had left, Phillips, Gabriel and Hackett, but none of them had really sort of made the breakthrough commercially as yet, and that was to come really with the 1980 Genesis album Duke, which got to number 1 in the British album charts, and Peter Gabriel 3, which got to also got to number 1 as well, in the British album charts,
so those were both released in the same year.
Yes. Yes. And so really they were starting to have more commercial success, which some of them found it easier than others. I mean, Ant Phillips, Tony Banks, Peter Gabriel and Steve Hackett, I don't think are as comfortable with the out and out commercial stuff. I think Collins and Rutherford are both
comfortable
with that, but
it shows with the sales, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because Phil Collins has sold so many records.
Yes.
And stuff.
Yes.
Mike Rutherford as well, with Mike and the Mechanics.
Yeah. And yet, I mean, when they do compilations of Genesis and Genesis related material, it has solo things from Gabriel, Banks, Hackett, and Collins, and it has Mike and the Mechanics stuff, but it doesn't have any solo stuff from Phillips or Rutherford or the stuff that Collins did with Brand X, which I think that it's just as much a part of the canon of work that they have done, and it's as I say, the solo things have produced some very good things, but I mean, probably the most commercially successful offshoots have been Genesis with the lineup of Banks, Collins and Rutherford, Collins as a solo artist, Gabriel as a solo artist, and Mike and the Mechanics. But that's not to the other things shouldn't be ignored because they are musically very good.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes things that are musically very good are perhaps more valid in some ways than the commercial stuff, because they tend to mean more to individual people. I think, and my own preference is for the stuff that's less commercial, because that, I mean, ironically, it's sort of it's there's almost this thing about, well, I know about something that you don't.
Yeah.
And so that can be, it can be more interesting for the individual.
Yeah. So what are they still doing now? Is any of them still recording? I know Phil Collins has had some health issues.
Yes. I mean, they some of them are still active. I mean, although Mike Rutherford stopped recording solo albums in 1982, his last solo album was Acting Very Strange. And Phil Collins, having done such albums as Moroccan Roll and Product with Brand X, stopped recording with Brand X in 1982 with the album Do They Hurt, and since then Mike Rutherford has done some things with Mike and the Mechanics, and Phil Collins has continued to do solo albums such as No Jacket Required and But Seriously, and Tony Banks has continued to record solo albums. I mean his 1983 album The Fugitive, and Ant Phillips has done several albums such as Wise After the Event, and Private Parts and Pieces, and Steve Hackett has done solo albums such as Defector, and Please Don't Touch. But I mean, there comes a point where you've had as much success as you're going to have. And there comes a point where there aren't any more ideas there. And
I suppose the struggle for those guys is, they've recorded such good songs. How do you top that?
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's rather like, if I can give an example, the Beatles. I mean, really together they did so much that really they created a cross for their own back. Because what they did after that, people were going to say, oh well, so and so solo stuff, it's not as good as the Beatles, even though it was possibly musically better.
Yeah.
But I mean, also there comes a point that, I mean, Phil Collins as a solo artist has had #1 singles and albums in Britain and the USA. Genesis, with the lineup of Banks, Collins and Rutherford, have had #1 albums in Britain and a #1 single in the US. And Peter Gabriel has had #1 albums in Britain and a #1 single in the US.
Yeah.
And Mike and the Mechanics have had a US #1 single. Now, the thing is that if Genesis and Peter Gabriel haven't had a British #1 single and a US #1 album by now, then they're not going to.
No.
So really, there comes a point where they've had as much success as they're going to, and really, I mean, the ideas and the motivation must reach a point where they think, well, really, I've been doing this for so long, and I'm getting a little bit bored of it.
Yeah, and they've made enough money to last a lifetime, so they're okay financially.
Yeah.
Right, Bill, I've enjoyed my lesson in Genesis. Yeah. Right, what we're going to venture into next time?
Oh.
On episode 3.
On episode 3, we shall look at the albums of the Beatles both as a group and as solo.
Brilliant stuff. Yeah. That's what's coming up next week. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for watching.
Thank you. Bye.